The 1980s were a wild time for sports cars. Manufacturers were trying everything: bold designs, futuristic tech, and turbocharged dreams. But not every car was a winner. Some looked the part but had nothing under the hood. Others were plagued with problems that left owners frustrated, and a few, well, they were just bad ideas from the start. We're diving into the 5 worst sports cars of the 1980s. These cars had potential, but instead of being legends, they became cautionary tales. Curious about these cars? Let's jump in. At first glance, the Pontiac Fiero seemed like a game changer. A mid-engine American sports car? That was unheard of outside high-end exotics. Pontiac marketed it as an affordable, lightweight, fuel-efficient 2-seater with styling that screamed future. When it hit the streets in 1984, it looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, sleek, sharp, and different from everything else on the road. But then reality hit. Under the hood, the base Fiero came with a 2.5-liter Iron Duke 4-cylinder engine, making a measly 92 horsepower. That's right, 92. A mid-engine sports car with less power than most compact sedans of the time. To make things worse, the Iron Duke had a reputation for being noisy and rough at higher RPMs. It felt more like an economy car than a true sports machine. Even when Pontiac introduced a 2.8-liter V6 with 140 horsepower in later models, it still wasn't enough to make the Fiero competitive. Performance wasn't the only issue. The Fiero borrowed parts from economy cars, including a front suspension from Chevrolet Chevette and a rear suspension from the Pontiac Phoenix. That Frankenstein approach led to handling that was less precision sports car and more hope and pray it stays on the road. It was twitchy, unpredictable, and far from the mid-engine dream Pontiac promised. And then, of course, there were the fires. Early models had an oil capacity issue, and when combined with defective connecting rods, they were prone to catching fire. By the time Pontiac finally sorted out the issues, the Fiero's reputation was toast. Literally. Sales tanked and the car was discontinued in 1988. Fiero proved that not every gamble pays off. It's still remembered today, not for its performance, but how much potential it wasted. When you think of muscle cars of the 1980s, Cadillac probably isn't the first brand that comes to mind. But in the late 80s, they tried to enter the luxury sports car market with the Alante. On paper, it seemed like a brilliant idea. Take a Cadillac, give it sleek European styling from Pininfarina, and throw in some American V8 power. What could go wrong? A lot, apparently. The Alante had an insane production process. Cadillac built the chassis in Detroit, shipped it to Italy for bodywork, and then flew it back to the US for final assembly. That meant every Alante body traveled 4,600 miles across the Atlantic, racking up costs and delays. The process was so complicated, it was called the Alante Air Bridge, which sounds cool, but it was a logistical nightmare. And for all that effort, the car wasn't even that fast. The early 4.1-liter V8 made just 170 horsepower, which wasn't enough to compete with the European roadsters it was trying to challenge. Later models bumped up to 200 horsepower with a 4.5-liter engine, but even that couldn't save the car from being a disappointment. It was heavy, slow, and handled like a big awkward Cadillac rather than a proper sports car. Then there was the convertible top problem. Cadillac designed the Alante as a 2-seater roadster, but the soft top leaked like a sieve. Cadillac tried fixing it over the years, but by then, the damage was done. The Alante wasn't just a bad sports car, it was one of the worst muscle cars of the 1980s in terms of execution. The idea of an American-Italian luxury roadster was exciting, but poor performance, a crazy production system, and quality issues doomed it from the start. If you've ever wondered about the most overrated muscle cars of the 1980s, the Dodge Daytona Turbo Z might be a top contender. Dodge wanted this to be their answer to affordable performance, something that looked fast, had turbo power, and could compete with other sporty coupes of the time. But the reality? It was a front-wheel drive K-car-based letdown. The Turbo Z was powered by a 2.2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder, which in theory should have made it fun. It initially cranked out 142 horsepower, which wasn't terrible for the era. Later versions pushed up to 174 horsepower, which sounded promising. But the problem wasn't just the power, it was how the car handled it. Instead of a proper sports car chassis, Daytona borrowed its platform from economy cars, specifically the Dodge Aries K car. That meant the handling was sloppy, the steering was vague, and the torque steer was brutal. Floor it, and the front wheels might fight for control instead of putting the power down smoothly. It didn't feel planted or refined, making it hard to enjoy, even with the turbo boost. And then there were the electronics. The Daytona was packed with digital gauges and high-tech, for the time, controls, but reliability was a nightmare. Owners complained about glitchy sensors, failing instrument clusters, and turbo lag so bad that it felt like the car was thinking about accelerating before actually doing it. It was a classic case of Dodge trying too hard to be futuristic, but ending up with a car that felt dated even before it hit the showroom floors. The Daytona Turbo Z represents a bigger trend from the 1980s, the era when American manufacturers were still trying to recapture the magic of the muscle cars from the 70s, but kept missing the mark. Dodge wanted the Turbo Z to be a performance icon, but instead, it ended up as just another overhyped, underwhelming attempt at sporty performance. And we're not done yet. There are 2 more 80s disasters to talk about, and trust me, they're just as bad. Maybe even worse. Stay tuned. If there was ever a car that promised more than it could deliver, it was the Chrysler TC by Maserati. Chrysler wanted to create a luxury sports car that blended USA nostalgia for classic muscle with Italian craftsmanship. Sounds great, right? Well, the execution was anything but. The TC was supposed to be an exotic alternative to other 1980s muscle cars, but when it debuted in 1989, it looked almost identical to the cheaper Chrysler LeBaron. That wasn't a coincidence, it was a LeBaron, just with minor tweaks and a Maserati badge. Buyers expecting something unique got an overpriced Chrysler with extra leather. Then came the engine options. A sports car needs power, but the TC's base engine was a 2.2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder, making just 160 horsepower. That's barely enough to make a sedan fun, let alone a grand touring coupe. Chrysler later offered a Mitsubishi-sourced 3.0-liter V6 and an upgraded Turbo 2 engine with 200 horsepower, but it was too late. None of these engines made the TC fast enough, especially in an era when even bad muscle cars struggled with weak performance. The TC's price was another problem. Chrysler charged over $30,000, a small fortune in the 20th century. The TC was built in Italy and shipped to the US, but its reliability was more Chrysler than Maserati. Disappointing. Electrical problems, poor build quality, and an overall lack of refinement made it one of the biggest 1980s car fails. By the time Chrysler pulled the plug in 1991, only about 7,300 units had been sold, making it one of the decade's biggest flops. The Chrysler TC by Maserati is something only baby boomers will understand, the hype and the letdown. It was supposed to be a luxury sports car, but ended up as an overpriced LeBaron with an Italian name. One of the most disappointing 80s cars, hands down. The Mercury Capri proves that a sporty name doesn't make a car a performance machine. Unlike its cousin, the Ford Mustang, the Capri never had the power or personality to be a real contender in the 1980s muscle car scene. Instead, it was one of the worst muscle cars of the decade. The Capri had been through multiple identity crises by the time the 1980s arrived. Originally a European-inspired coupe, by 1979 it had become a rebadged Mustang. That sounds promising. After all, the Mustang had legendary status among bad muscle cars. But while the Mustang had decent V8 options, the Capri often got weaker engines. The base model had a 2.3-liter 4-cylinder with just 88 horsepower. Even the 5.0-liter V8, the most powerful option, only pushed out 140 to 175 horsepower, depending on the year. Compared to the classic Mustangs or better 80s muscle cars, the Capri felt sluggish. Special editions like the Capri RS Turbo tried to fix this, but with only 120 horsepower, it wasn't much faster. Worse, it had turbo lag and overheating issues, making it unreliable. Buyers expected Mustang-like performance, but got something barely quicker than a regular compact. Then came the styling problem. The Capri looked like a slightly different Mustang, but lacked name recognition. Later models had a bubble-back rear window, meant to look futuristic, but it just hurt visibility. Unlike other American nostalgia cars, the Capri didn't have the bold look that made people excited about 1980s muscle cars. By the late 80s, the writing was on the wall. The Capri was just a cheaper, less exciting Mustang, and buyers knew it. Sales slumped, and by 1986, Mercury discontinued it. The Capri never had a real identity. It wasn't powerful enough for 1980s muscle cars, stylish enough to stand out, or reliable enough to compete. It's one of those disappointing 80s cars that people barely remember. If there's anything to learn from the Capri, it's that a great name means nothing if the car isn't great. The 1980s brought some exciting sports cars, but not every model crossed the finish line. These flops prove that not all 80s muscle cars were winners. Which one do you think was the worst? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more automotive deep dives. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.